The year was 1887, and silence clung to Esther Hale's farm like frost on morning grass unyielding. Heavy and ever-present, it wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a weight that settled into the corners of her cabin, thick as the dust on the mantel above the cold, lifeless hearth. It pressed into the grain of the kitchen table, where she took her meals alone, and lingered in the hollow space beside her in the bed, a ghost of warmth long gone, for 2 years, since fever had burned through her husband Arthur like a prairie fire in dry season. That silence had become her truest companion. It whispered through the still air, echoed through the empty barn, sat heavily on the porch beside her, staring out across the vast Wyoming expanse. The land itself mirrored her, grief barren in places, too open in others. The sagebrush hills rolled like held breath, and the sky above them stretched too wide, too vacant, as if it, too, mourned an aching stillness. Esther moved through her days as one does through deep water, slow, deliberate, and numb to everything except survival. She clung to routine with white-knuckled resolve, her only defense against the rising tide of sorrow. Before dawn, she rose with the bruised sky and its palette of soft purples and smudged rose, slipping on her boots in the chill and heading out to tend the work that tethered her to purpose. She milked the lone cow, fed the restless chickens, checked on her modest vegetable patch, and swept the dust from her doorstep, all with the economical grace of someone who had nothing left to waste, not even time. The townspeople of redemption, a small sprawl of weather-beaten buildings and narrower minds, saw only her strength, a capable widow, self-sufficient and unsentimental. They didn't see the woman who sometimes stood with her palm pressed flat to the old splintered wood of Arthur's workbench, her shoulders trembling beneath her shawl as a single, heated tear traced a path through the grit on her cheek. Always just one tear, never more. They praised her resilience, but inside, it felt far more like surrender. Men like Garrett Shaw saw something else: opportunity. The portly merchant, always dressed a little finer than he needed to be and far too confident in his opinions, never missed a chance to corner her in his store. With oily smiles and a voice slick with mock concern, he'd say, "It's too much. This place for a woman on her own, Esther, a respectable widow like yourself, ought to be in town, among company, where folks can look after you." His words always came wrapped in soft tones, but they were a cage disguised as care. Each one twisted her stomach into knots. At just 32, she was already being shelved like an old book, her life reduced to a chapter concluded. Her trips into town were infrequent and made only when necessary. Redemption's narrow streets were filled with averted gazes, the hushed murmurs of idle pity, and the stares of people who didn't know what to do with grief that wouldn't fold neatly away. Esther met them all with quiet grace, her tightly held shopping list clutched like a shield. On one stifling August afternoon, she guided her wagon along the dusty main street, sweat beading beneath her bonnet, her thoughts on flour and salt, and the blessed return to solitude that, while painful, was at least honest. But something was wrong. The street was restless, humming with noise and ugly anticipation. A crowd had formed in the square outside Shaw's Mercantile. Farmers, ranch hands, townsfolk, faces flushed with heat, and something crueler stood in a ring, eyes fixed on the makeshift platform where Garrett Shaw stood atop a crate, basking in the center of it all like a showman with no soul. 2 armed men flanked him, and between them stood a figure that made Esther's breath stop mid-inhale. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his body clearly built by hard labor and survival. His skin held the sun-darkened hue of the Navajo, and though his hands were bound tightly in front of him with coarse rope and his ankles shackled, he stood with such absolute stillness that it unnerved her. A burlap sack had been pulled over his head and cinched at the neck with cruel efficiency, turning him into a faceless silhouette of power restrained. He didn't move, didn't flinch, not even when Shaw stepped forward and jabbed a smug finger into the man's arm. "Found him, wandering on Prescott land," Shaw declared, his voice ringing with the self-importance of someone who mistook cruelty for authority. A stray, a drifter, but just look at the build on him. Strength like that ought not go to waste. There was a low ripple of laughter from the crowd. Shaw smirked. "I spoke to the marshal, rather than let him rot in a jail cell. We're offering a service, 1 year's labor contract, He'll work for whoever wins the bid. Let's start at $5. Esther felt her insides twist. This wasn't a contract, it was a degradation. A grotesque performance meant to reinforce power and dominance. The man wasn't property, but they were treating him as such, reducing him to an object for barter. The crowd responded with sneers and insults thinly veiled as bids. $2, someone jeered. Can't see what I'm buying with that sack on his head. $3, barked another, snickering. Bet he's good for more than plowing. Fields. Esther stood at the edge of the crowd, frozen. But her eyes were locked on the man's stillness, and suddenly, she saw herself reflected in him. That quiet refusal to yield. That defiant silence, but where hers was resignation. His felt like a storm held beneath skin. A sudden spark flared inside her, something wild and unfamiliar. She was done being the passive object of pity and control. She would not stand by and let another human soul be stripped bare in the town square. $1, she said. The words were not loud, but they cut through the heat and murmur like a blade. Heads turned sharply. Conversations ceased. Garrett Shaw squinted, blinking in disbelief, before his face split into a mocking grin. Esther, he drawled, savoring the spectacle. Did I hear that right? She tightened her grip on the handle of her basket, lifting her chin. $1. The crowd exploded in murmurs. A woman bidding? A widow, no less. And such a price insultingly low. A mockery. Shaw's amusement soured. This wasn't the power play he'd envisioned. He looked around for someone to raise the bid. But the other men hesitated. No one wanted to be the one who outbid the widow. It would look shameful. And so, by sheer absurdity, her offer stood. Fine, Shaw snapped, his voice thick with scorn. Sold to the widow Hale. $1. Congratulations. He jerked his head at his men, who handed her the rope like they were tossing scraps to a stray dog. It was thick and rough and alive with implication. As she took it, it felt heavier than anything she'd ever held, an anchor tied to something she hadn't yet named. The crowd parted like water before her as she stepped forward, every eye heavy on her back, every gaze crawling with confusion, disdain, or something uglier. She stopped in front of the man. Up close, he was immense. His presence something that filled the air, shifting it. She could hear the quiet rasp of his breath through the sack. Her heart pounded. What had she done? Still, she did not falter. She gave the rope a quiet, firm tug. Come, she said. He followed, without resistance, shackled feet dragging through the dust in a slow rhythm that rang louder than any whip crack. As they passed through Redemption Center, it wasn't just the townsfolk who stared. The silence that trailed behind them was something new and settled, uncertain. The journey home felt longer than the road ever had. Esther held the reins tightly, her mind a storm of doubt. She hadn't acted out of practicality. Her small farm had no need for the strength of the man in the wagon bed behind her. What had driven her hand wasn't reason, it was instinct, fury, and something else she could hardly name. She had seen him humiliated, had felt the echo of her own erasure in his wordless stillness, and she had refused to stand silent one more time. But now, she had brought a stranger, a bound man full of unknown thoughts and a history he hadn't been allowed to speak, to her home. She didn't know if he would hate her for it. She didn't even know his name. By the time they arrived, the sun was bleeding into the horizon, painting the sky with fire. Everything looked different. Her home, once her haven, now bristled with tension. She climbed down and tied the horse, then stepped to the back of the wagon. You can get down, she said softly. He moved slowly, swinging his legs over the side, landing with a muted thud. The chains clinked. She turned away from the oppressive stillness between them and walked to the well. The pump's squeak was the only sound in the world as she filled a dipper with water. When she turned and held it out, he hesitated. Then, awkwardly, he took it in his bound hands and drank. She watched his throat move beneath the coarse sack. It was unbearable. I'm going to take that off your head, she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. No one belongs in something like that. I will not hurt you. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of something ancient and true. She half expected him to recoil, to flinch or turn away, but he did nothing. He simply stood there, still as carved stone. his breath slow and steady beneath the rough burlap. Esther's fingers trembled as she reached up to the knot at his neck, the rope scratchy and stiff with sweat and dust. The sack carried the stifling scent of confinement fear soaked into old fabric. Sweat soaked into sun. Her nails scraped against the knot, her fingertips clumsy with nerves. Finally, the knot gave, the rope slackened, and with one shallow breath, she pulled the sack free. The air between them held still. It wasn't some romantic flutter, not the hollow ache of a lonely woman projecting fantasy onto a stranger. It was something deeper, something ancient and elemental, like lightning finding metal. What she uncovered beneath the sack was not the face of a criminal or savage. It was a face that belonged to the land itself, honed and weathered, proud and silent. His cheekbones were sharp and high, the lines of his face as strong and unyielding as the mesas that rose from the desert floor. His nose was straight, his lips full but drawn in a firm, unreadable line, but it was his eyes that took. Her breath, dark, fathomless eyes like canyon shadows, filled with things too vast to name. In them burned a fury too long banked, a grief too deep for words, and something else, dignity that had not yielded, even beneath rope and sackcloth. He was not broken, he was shackled, but fiercely, undeniably whole. And in that moment, Esther didn't see a laborer, she didn't see a burden. She saw a man who had been reduced, not by nature, but by cruelty. A man whose silence spoke louder than any scream. Her chest ached with the realization that her own grief-walled heart recognized the prison in his. She had not rescued him. She had simply seen him and, in doing so, seen herself. He stared at her without blinking, and in his gaze was a question as sharp as any blade. Are you another captor, another cage? Without speaking, Esther turned on her heel and went inside. When she returned, her hands clutched a small kitchen knife. Its blade gleamed softly in the dying light. She walked toward him, her breath shallow, the beat of her heart thunderous in her ears. She held the knife out not in threat, but in offering. Your hands, she said gently, gesturing toward the thick ropes binding his wrists. His eyes narrowed. The moment held its breath. She could kill him. He knew that. He could overpower her, and she knew that too. But neither moved. Time stretched, strained. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, he extended his bound hands toward her, slow and deliberate. She stepped closer. The ropes were tightly wound, cutting into the skin where they had rubbed raw. Her hands trembled as she slid the blade beneath the knot, sawing carefully, slowly. Strand by strand, the fibers gave. When the last one snapped, the rope slithered to the ground. He didn't move, didn't rub his wrists, didn't speak. He simply stood there, flexing his fingers with quiet resolve. He didn't run. He didn't rage. He just watched her. She stepped back, the knife still in her hand, feeling strangely lightheaded. Her voice was unsteady when she said, "There's a loft in the barn. Blankets. You can sleep there." He gave the smallest nod and acknowledgement, not submission, and turned. The dull clink of chains on his ankles following him as he walked into the dusk. Esther watched until he disappeared behind the barn doors. Then she went inside, bolted the door for the first time in 2 years, and collapsed into Arthur's old chair. Her body racked with trembling. She had not brought home a helper. She had brought home a storm. The days that followed unfolded like the tense hush before thunder. They lived in parallel silences, she in the house, he in the barn. Each morning, she left a plate on the stump outside his door, bread, cheese, smoked meat, then returned to the house without looking back. Hours later, the plate would be empty, left neatly in its place. From her window, she caught glimpses of him moving through her yard like a shadow given flesh. His steps fluid despite the iron that still bound his ankles. The chains had been an afterthought, left on because in the frenzy of that auction, she had forgotten the key sat on Garrett Shaw's desk. She didn't give him orders. She had no right. What could she say to a man she had bought in front of a crowd like cattle, a man whose silence was louder than her own mourning? So she watched and waited and wondered. On the third day, she saw him approach the axe by the woodpile. Her body tensed. Her mind conjured terrible images, his hands gripping the haft, swinging it clean through her skull. But he only lifted it, tested its weight in one large hand. then walked to the pile of uncut wood she had been battling for weeks. With strength and precision that stole her breath, he split every last log. The steady rhythm of his work echoed through the farm like a second heartbeat, each thud of the axe a metronome of quiet power. He worked until the sun bled into the hills and the pile was stacked neat and high. That evening, she did not leave. His meal on the stump, she placed it at the far end of her kitchen table. Then she left the door ajar and took her seat, her back to the entrance, hands twisted tightly in her lap, the sounds of the night pressed in the rustle of dry grass, the hum of crickets, her own pulse roaring in her ears. Then she heard it, the soft, unmistakable drag of his shackled steps. He paused in the doorway, and for a long moment the air felt electrified. He stepped inside. The scrape of a chair across the floor was deafening, then silence again, shared, but not empty. They ate without words, 6 feet of table and a universe of unspoken things between them. Each night after that, he returned. He never asked, she never called, but he came. The rhythm of their world began to shift. It was still quiet, but no longer hollow. It had shape, contour. One afternoon, a sudden windstorm barreled over the plains. A loose shutter on the barn clattered. Dangerously, Esther ran to it, struggling to hold the pin in place. Then a hand warm, steady closed over hers. He was beside her, wordless. He hammered the shutter shut as easily as one might close a drawer. Their hands touched, fingers tangled. Her breath caught. She stepped back quickly, cheeks hot. He nodded once and walked away. The chains still bound his ankles, and the key haunted her. She couldn't bear it. A week after he arrived, she hitched the wagon and drove back into town. Her stomach churning, she walked straight into Shaw's. Mercantile. He looked up with smug delight. "Esther," he drawled, "come for more supplies? Or grown tired of your purchase?" "I want the key," she said flatly. He blinked. "Key to the shackles," she clarified, her tone icy. "You'll give it to me." He smirked. "That's not yours. He's still a ward of the territory. I let you take him to keep the peace. Those chains stay on for your protection, and the town's." Something sharp and wild surged through her, something that tasted like the heat of the forge. "He's on my land, under my care. He's not yours anymore. Give me the key, or I ride to Cheyenne and tell them marshal you auction men in the street." He faltered. The bluff was fragile, but her gaze was not. She didn't look like a grieving widow anymore. She looked like land itself, scarred, but unmoving. A storm standing upright. With a scowl, he reached beneath the counter and slapped the rusted iron key onto the wood. "On your head be it," he growled. She took it without a word and left. The ride home felt like victory. She found him by the creek, sitting on a rock, eyes on the water. She approached quietly, then knelt beside him and held out the key. He looked at it, then at her dot without speaking. He lifted one foot, then the other. The locks were stiff with rust. She twisted hard, her hand aching, until the iron clanked open. The moment the shackle dropped, it was as though the earth sighed. He stood, slowly, stretching his legs, and then he looked at her, a long, searching look. "Bidzell," he said. His voice, low and resonant, sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first word he had spoken since she brought him home. She echoed it, softly. "Bidzell. It means, he is strong," he said, his English deliberate, shaped with care. That night, something shifted again. He didn't just eat. He spoke. Not of his capture, not yet, but of where he was from. Of red rock mesas and skies that shimmered with turquoise. Of sheep, of stories, of wind that carried memory. Esther, in turn, found herself speaking of Arthur, not his death, but the life they'd shared. His laugh, his stubborn dreams, the way he'd drawn plans for the barn that now housed another soul. They sat long into the night, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence around Esther wasn't empty. It was full with stories, with breath, with the fragile, stubborn roots of something growing. The farm began to change. It was no longer a place of quiet endurance, but of quiet transformation. Bidzell knew things: how to coax health from sick soil, how to listen to the winds, warnings, how to build with what the land offered instead of against it. She watched him, learned from him, and without either of them meaning to, they began to share more than labor. They shared space, presence, a wary kind of peace, not yet trust, but something very much like the beginning of it. He showed her where the willows whispered secrets of hidden water, their leaves fluttering like 1,000 small flags above precious springs. He taught her to read the sky, to see the truth behind the clouds, how the flat-bottomed thunderheads carried storms in their bellies, how a sudden hush in the wind was nature holding its breath. With hands as steady as time itself, he climbed onto the roof and mended the sagging boards of the barn, moving with a purpose and grace that came from a lifetime of knowing how to endure. In return, she offered him words, English ones, simple at first, then flowering into the ornate verses of Arthur's beloved, tattered Shakespeare. She read to him aloud in the evenings, her voice tentative at first, then stronger as he listened with the quiet patience of someone who had known long silences. When he attempted the words himself, stumbling over their tangled poetry, they laughed together, the sound light and surprising, a melody rising in a house that had long been hushed with sorrow. Peace came slowly, like thaw in early spring. Esther found herself loosening, blooming. The void inside her, once echoing with loss, began to fill with a gentler quiet, the comfort of another's steady presence, the solace of shared tasks. She watched him from the window as he worked, the way sunlight caught in his hair, the effortless power in his stride, the solemn focus in his brow, and often when she glanced up, she found his gaze already on her, not with hunger, not with possession, but with a deep, quiet regard that made something shift in her chest. But beyond the fences of the farm, the world bristled. The town of redemption had not forgotten. Their lives had become the stuff of whispered warnings, the subject of tight-lipped conversations and judgmental glances exchanged in pews. Garrett Shaw poured oil on the fire, his pride wounded, his envy sharpening into hate. Esther's refusal had made her an affront to the order he believed himself to rule. The threat came with the bite of early autumn. Esther was in the chicken coop when she heard hooves hammering the earth. She stepped out into the pale morning light and saw 5 riders cresting the rise, rifles gleaming, grim purpose in their eyes. Shaw rode at the head, his mouth twisted in a sneer. Bizil appeared then, emerging from the barn like a statue come to life, his shoulders wide, his face unreadable. He moved to her side without a word, a wall of quiet resolve. Esther, Shaw called, reining in. His voice was honey-laced with venom. We've come for the Navajo. The judge comes next week. He'll want to know where the prisoner is. He's not a prisoner, Esther said, her voice calm despite the trembling in her bones. She stepped forward, just enough to place herself between Shaw and Bizil. He is a free man, and he works for me, Shaw scoffed, contempt curling his lips. Free? He's a danger, a savage. People are worried. Women are saying you're compromised. The only danger here is you, she said, her voice rising with a heat she hadn't known she possessed. 5 armed men riding onto my land uninvited, threatening someone who has harmed no one. One of the men spat. He's not a man. He's an Indian, and you're a disgrace. The words hit her like stones, but she did not bend. Instead, she looked at Bizil. She saw not the savage they imagined, but a man of deep strength and endless stillness. She saw the land she and Arthur had carved from wildness, the dreams they had buried beneath every furrowed row, and she saw what they had built. Now not just a farm, but a life. You are not welcome here, she said, the words ringing out like church bells. This is my land, and I say, leave. Shaw's face turned red with fury. He dismounted, the others following suit. Tension stretched like a wire between them. And then Bizil moved, not with violence, not with fear, just one step forward, tall and unflinching, placing himself before her like a mountain before the storm. His silence was louder than their threats. His stillness was defiance. Esther turned on her heel and strode to the porch, coming back with Arthur's rifle cradled in her arms. She did not raise it. She didn't need to. It was the weight of her will that spoke. I won't ask again. Shaw looked at the rifle, at Bazil's broad frame, at Esther's eyes burning with unrelenting fire. He saw the line had been drawn, and he would not cross it. Not today. This isn't over. He growled, backing away. It is for you. She replied. They watched the riders retreat, dust trailing behind them like regret. Only when the last hoofbeat had faded did she lower the rifle. Her hands shook, her knees went soft, but inside, something had crystallized, something hard and enduring. She turned to Bizil. He was watching her, and in his eyes she saw something, unguarded at last, not just gratitude, not just relief, but awe and a respect so deep it undid her. He reached out then, not with a firestorm, but with quiet reverence, his hand resting over hers where it gripped the stock. That touch did not spark. It surged. It held Dot in the days that followed. The world around them did not change, but they did. The rhythm of their lives became a quiet duet. They moved together, two hearts stitched by shared work, shared breath. They planted bulbs and turned the soil. They sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch, watching dusk fall like a prayer. In the soft hush between chores and rest, Esther found herself humming. And sometimes he joined her. The town of redemption receded into the background like a bitter wind behind closed shutters. The farm became more than refuge. It became a promise. Esther was no longer a wraith trailing her husband's memory. She had become something else entirely, a woman forged in fire, tempered by loss, and remade by choice. And Bizil was no longer a man in chains. He had shed the town's cruelty like a serpent's old skin. He stood tall beside her, no longer captive, no longer alien. He was home, one evening, as snowflakes fell slow and silver against the windows. They sat across from each other at the table. The light from the oil lamp shimmered on his features, that strong jaw. Those watchful eyes now softened with something that looked like peace. She reached for his hand, and he took it, their fingers intertwining like vines grown toward the same sun. That single dollar had bought neither labor nor obedience. It had purchased the spark of transformation. She had tried to salvage her survival. What she had found was grace, and love, quiet, steady, like the fall of snow settled around them, softening everything it touched.